Good afternoon, everyone. I am so very pleased to see so many people joining us for this amazing panel discussion this afternoon. Feeling the heat, global climate solutions after Paris, such an important topic for us to be discussing right now. My name is Shauna DeLuca. I'm with the Office of International Programs. This afternoon's program is brought to you by the Office of International Programs and the School of Environmental Sustainability, SOJUS. The way this will work is Dr. Peter Backlund, our moderator, will present the panelists this afternoon. They will give some brief comments about their work, their opinions, their research, and then Dr. Backlund will then engage in some conversation with the panelists, and then we will open it up to question and answer. We hope you all engage with us on this discussion. And before I turn it over to Dr. Backlund, I want to give him a brief introduction because he's quite amazing in his own right too. He is the Associate Director of the School of Global Environmental Sustainability here at CSU. He has devoted his career to the planning, management, and leadership of complex research activities. His interests include the interactions of environmental, societal, and economic factors in sustainability, the relationship of human activities and the environmental changes, assessment of climate change risk and response strategies, use of scientific research for decision-making and public policy, development and use of information and observational technologies, and improving the communication of scientific information to non-technical audiences. Dr. Backlund has helped lead assessments of the effects of climate change on land resources, water resources, biodiversity, agriculture, and global food security. He is a fellow of the American Association of Advancement of Sciences and a very valued member of our Colorado State University family. So please help me welcome our panel members.
Thanks for that, Shauna. Is this on? You guys hear me? Okay, I'm really gratified to even be asked to moderate this panel. We've got three very distinguished CSU folks up here, and I couldn't be more pleased than to have the chance to have this discussion with them. The three panelists sitting next to me here, down at the end, is Ken Shockley. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Colorado State, where he holds the Holmes-Ralston III Chair in Environmental Ethics and Philosophy, and Ken's work really centers around the role of environmental values in public policy and the ethical dimensions of climate change policy and ecological restoration and a lot of other problems in philosophical ethics that I think are too complicated for me to understand. But we're really lucky to have him here, and you can see how his background and interests really fit with this. And in addition to all that, he has actually spent time the last few years attending some of the Conference of Parties meetings, the International Climate Negotiations, so he's familiar with that process, and we're really looking forward to what he has to say. Next to him is Michele Betsill. She is Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department here at CSU, and she, prior to joining CSU, was a postdoc at the Kennedy School at Harvard and was also affiliated with NCAR down in Boulder for a while, which is where I also used to work. Michele's done a lot of work and is an expert on the intersection of environmental politics and international relations. And in particular, she's very interested in what you might characterize as kind of grassroots or bottoms-up climate activism and activity and how that influences the development and implementation of climate policy and climate action. So she really knows a lot about the role of local action in what you might call climate governance. And right next to me here is Governor Bill Ritter, who I'm sure most of you recognize and know. He was Colorado's 41st governor, elected in 2006. And Bill's interested in a lot of things, but has played an incredibly important role in the development of energy systems and energy policy in our state. I think I could say without exaggeration, he's probably played a greater role than any other individual in promoting the transition from traditional fossil fuels to a more sustainable future in Colorado, and in particular in introducing a very strong renewable standard in Colorado, which really was a national example that has had tremendous effects ever since Colorado did it in encouraging other states to take action likewise. He's now the director of the Center for the New Energy Economy here at CSU and is advising all kinds of states and localities on how they can best incentivize the transition to cleaner energy systems in the future. And just as a little plug, we'll say coming up at the end of this month is the large energy transition symposium that CNEE hosts every year. That will be right here at the Laurie Student Center at the end of the month, and I encourage all of you to check that out. So we're going to start and let each one of the panelists make a statement about their work and their views on the topic of the symposium. Then, as Shauna said, we'll have a little bit of back and forth where we allow the panelists to question each other, and I may pose a few questions to them, and then we'll throw it open to Q&A from the audience. So with that, I'd like to ask Michele to start and tell us a little bit about her views on the subject.
Are you going to keep me honest? Time me?
I will keep you honest.
All right. So my thinking on sort of where we are in terms of climate change politics and policy making is informed by having studied and observed what I would call the global climate change governance politics for the last 20 years. And so I want to sort of step back, get out of the fray of whatever today's controversy is, and think about what has happened over the last 20-some years. And I think there's been three important changes that to me seem to have, I think, put us on a path to, on a promising path. This is sort of, I guess, why people always say, how can you be optimistic and work on the issue of climate change? And I guess I'm going to lay that on the table for a minute. So I began studying climate change politics and governance in 1996. And at that time, if you were interested in this issue, you went to the UN. That's where the issue was happening. We understood climate change in a fairly simplistic way as a collective action problem. We just need countries to come up to it with an agreement about how to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, set some rules. No country could do it on their own, so they needed to coordinate, and you do that through multilateral negotiations and through the UN. So, and there was a lot of optimism at that point about the ability of these multilateral processes to work. So off I went to a few of the conferences of the parties and saw what was happening. But of course that process stalled by the early 2000s. Countries were unable to reach any sort of aggressive agreement. There were deep divides between the global north and the global south. And it turns out that the climate change issue is a little bit more complicated than just a simple collective action problem. So if you're watching the UN process, it was pretty slow. It was like watching sort of a bread dough rise or something for about a decade. But something really interesting was happening sort of off the radar screen. The private sector, as well as officials at the subnational level, cities and governors and states in the US, stepped in to fill that void. And very explicitly in many cases sort of said, okay, if national governments aren't going to deal with this issue, we're going to step in and do it. They adopted climate action plans, renewable portfolio standards, developed emissions trading markets, emissions reporting standards, corporate sustainability programs, and really just began experimenting with lots and lots of different ways to try to deal with the issue of climate change. And the result was a fundamental shift in thinking about what it means to deal with climate change. Who should make some rules? Whose responsibility it was to deal with this? So you now have, instead of just national governments, you have elected officials at virtually all levels of government, the private sector, citizens, faith communities, and really thinking about climate change not just as this sort of technical issue of getting fewer emissions into the atmosphere, but really recognizing the way that carbon and climate and energy are sort of intertwined in so many aspects of our lives, everything from infrastructure decision-making to how we sort of use energy in our own homes. And so it's really, I think, in that way, laid the foundation for a much broader and more comprehensive and transformational approach to climate change. We're certainly not there yet, but I think it has put us on a different path than would have been otherwise. The second change is that it has changed the politics of the international negotiations. So I would argue that in the absence of these private sector and subnational activities, you wouldn't have the Paris Agreement. So 2009 in the Copenhagen meeting, the Conference of the Parties, the treaty negotiations basically broke down. countries could not get through this impasse of working, how to cross this divide between the North and the South. It was incredibly complex. And really, almost as sort of an exasperation, the leader said, okay, if we're not going to agree on a common set of rules, what are you willing to do? And that shifted the approach where individual countries would now come and pledge what they were willing to do, and they would be held accountable by a review process. They would have to report, and they would be reviewed. When they then turned around and went home and said, okay, what is it that I can actually promise to do? All of a sudden they realized their companies, their subnational governments, their communities were taking all these actions. So they could sort of add all those things up and put those on the table and say, well, here's what we're willing to do. And now recognizing these as important actors in the global response. What they also found was a political constituency to support climate action. And I know this gets lost in the US when you sort of listen to the rhetoric and what's happening in Washington, DC. But we absolutely saw this when the Trump administration was deciding whether to pull out of Paris. You had mayors and corporate leaders engaged in public campaigns, taking out full-page ads in the New York Times, trying to get the president to stay in. And just 5 days after he announced the withdrawal, 1,200 governors, mayors, business leaders, investors, and college and university presidents issued a statement calling the U.S. withdrawal, quote, out of step with what's happening in the United States and pledging to continue to work towards the Paris commitment. And I think Bill will talk more about what is actually happening in that way. But so again, there's this political constituency that didn't exist 20 years ago, even in the US, that I think is an important game changer. Okay, and the last point I'm going to make, and this gets into sort of international relations theory, so my students that are here, I'm going to be a constructivist for a moment. I think there's been a change in the normative structure for dealing with climate change. So in international relations theory, we think that ideas about what's appropriate, what you should do, shape how countries define what their interests are and how they pursue those interests. But you can't really see norms. You don't really know if a norm's there until norm-breaking behavior occurs. When somebody breaks a norm, you look at how everybody else responds. And what we saw almost instantaneously after Trump announced the withdrawal, some people feared, other countries are going to say, well, if the US isn't going to play, we're not going to play. But instead, virtually every other national leader came out and publicly reiterated their support for climate action. The Chinese went on the public stage and said, we're going to step in and be the leaders. Major CEOs of companies have pledged to continue to do what they're going to do. I think 5 days after the announcement, Walmart said, we're going to have an entirely new sustainability program. So I think the reaction against the Trump withdrawal essentially demonstrates, again, how much the federal government is out of step with what's happening, not only in the US, but around the world.
Thanks, Michele. So let's turn now from the perspective of a political scientist and expert from that domain to a practitioner of actual politics and hear what he has to say. Governor Ritter?
My degree from CSU is in political science, so not that I'm devoid of science in that regard. So thanks, Michele, and actually it is a really good sequitur from my perspective because we do a lot of work at the center that I'm presently in with states, some with local governments, some with private corporations, and I was also at Paris, and I was badged by the State Department to speak about the role of subnational governments in meeting national targets. So the roles that states and cities played. We didn't do much about private corporations, although there were panels there that talked about the private sector and where they were heading. And let me just sort of say from the work that we do and a lot that went on prior to my coming to CSU while I was governor, and even prior to being governor, Michelle's exactly right. If you're reading a European newspaper about climate action in America, you're reading about inaction. And that's been the case since the Kyoto Protocol was not taken up by the United States Senate. They pay attention to the Congress. Seldom do they pay attention to things happening sort of in a federal system at the state or local government. And yet, we have led the world in reducing emissions, but not because of federal policy. There's Clean Air Act stuff that we can say is well regarded at the federal level, but there's so much that has happened at the state and local level. So this center that I run here works with governors. We work with a variety of partners, with the Nature Conservancy. We work with states across the country. We run a legislators academy. There are 30 states in this country that have a 30 states in the country that have a renewable portfolio standard. That means a certain percentage of their power has to come from renewable energy. If you put all the people who live in those states in one place, it'd be the 5th largest country in the world. That's how big it is. And you have states like Rhode Island, Hawaii, New York, that are heading to 100% renewables. You have states like California and Oregon that are at 50%. You have a bunch of states that are 30% renewable energy standard. And those renewable energy standards did much more than just help reduce emissions. They also created markets. And so the reason we call it sort of the new energy economy, it's getting kind of middle-aged by now, but we call it that because there's an economic reality that's come with that actually is a business case for doing these kinds of things that reduce emissions. And we focus a lot on renewable portfolio standards, but as many and more states have an energy efficiency resource standard. Now there are states that are developing energy storage standards where the state has to have a certain amount of energy storage for the utilities in their portfolio. And so at the state level, we've done and seen a variety of things that have been really important in helping our country reduce its emissions. The second part of that is, even though there is still a great deal of partisanship, it's less at the state level than it is at the federal level. The federal level, it's wicked, and it's wickedly bad. And climate was actually made, I think, a wedge issue during the Obama presidency. Maybe not so much in 2008. John McCain was on board climate solutions. But certainly by 2012, it was a political wedge issue, and you were partisan. You know, if you're a Republican, you lined up on one side of climate, and if you were a Democrat, you lined up on the other, typically, not always. But what we're seeing at the state level is a variety of Republican governors who've done some very bold things in moving a clean energy agenda for their state. So the Nevada governor just signed 9 clean energy bills. The Michigan governor, these are all Republicans, signed clean energy legislation last year. There was a big transition for the state of Michigan. The Illinois governor signed a clean energy plan, involved nuclear, so there was some controversy among environmentalists about whether nuclear should be a part of it, but it was 50% of their portfolio already, and he couldn't see leaving that behind, and so it's carbon-free. He signed it, it's considered clean energy. The governor of Ohio, President candidate John Kasich, vetoed a bill that would have put a moratorium, extended moratorium on the renewable portfolio standard. So you have that happening at the state level. At the local level, you have cities across America, and even cities that exist in some red states where it's hard to move a clean energy agenda. Let's take Texas, for example. San Antonio and Austin are moving their own energy agenda that's actually a very ambitious agenda where cities are concerned, and they're going to do it in the context of the state of Texas, and they're also able to demonstrate an economic case for this. So there's a lot of people on the Republican side, a group called the Conservatives Energy Network, they're not mentioning climate change when they're making sort of these bold moves on clean energy. They're more about the business case because they don't want the conversation to die an early death because you brought up climate change in a room full of people who might not agree with you, or at least parts of that room may not agree with you. You take mayors across this country, the things that we're doing at city levels is going to have this really dramatic impact. I mentioned Fort Collins has its own public utility, but Denver is it's a customer of Xcel Energy. It's 20% of their load, so they have a climate action plan that Xcel is now filing a resource plan with the Public Utilities Commission to say we have to meet Denver's climate action plan in order for us to be their franchisor, in order to have that franchise agreement. And you see that across the country where either the municipal utility is making its own impact because the city has a climate action plan, or you see this, a utility saying we have to react to that city. At the city level, really partisan politics almost goes away. So what we see at a really kind of toxic level at the federal government, and see less of it at the state government, but still see it present, we see almost none of that at the city level. And so local government becomes this really important place to do what's necessary for us to move this clean energy agenda in a nonpartisan way. And as Michele alluded to, corporations are also doing really important things. Just recently, Microsoft completed the largest independent power purchase of clean energy, 500 megawatts of wind in Kansas and Wyoming, and then they left their utility. In the state of Washington, they basically got a divorce from Puget Sound Energy. They paid millions for it, but they got a divorce. In Nevada, MGM Grand, one of the largest gaming companies in the world, has left NV Energy. It will no longer be a franchisee and have this agreement. It wants to purchase 100% renewables on the independent power producer market and not part of the franchise. So these are all the kinds of things that are going away. I think what we'll get into, hopefully in the Q&A, Peter, is a discussion about the international impact, because while I see some positives, as does Michele, happening domestically on reducing emissions, the energy sector is actually going pretty well. Transportation's not going so well. Transportation emissions eclipsed energy generation for the first time since 1975 or 76. So we really have to pay attention to the transportation sector like we have the energy sector, and we have lost a lot on the international front as the United States of America because of the Trump administration's actions on Paris, and I think we'll talk about that.
We certainly will. Ken?
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for international programs and for SOGIS for sponsoring this. It's a real privilege to be here with this group of panelists, and well, part of me is happy that we have this panel, and part of me thinks we shouldn't have to have it at all. The change and the trauma associated with the exit of Paris is something that sometimes I think is too easy to gloss over. So I'm going to be a downer. I'm going to cast a bucket of cold water. I'm going to also mix a lot of metaphors. So mostly, in fact, I'm in agreement. I think I'm in print in agreement with what my panelists have said. I think there's a lot of hope. There are ways forward. There are great possibilities. But I mean, part of me thinks this is lemonade built with some very real lemons. And let me start. This is my metaphor. And let me try to characterize this. So I've been at the COP meetings, these annual UNFCCC meetings, for a bunch of years. A lot less than 20, but I've been at a lot of them. Not the interesting ones like Paris and Copenhagen, but I've been at the COP meetings. And I arrived in Marrakesh a couple days after the election of President Trump. And it was long enough that they'd gone through the stages of mourning, so there were no longer people rocking in the corners, trying to stand up again. And instead, now there were people forming communities and developing a response, because nothing forms a community like a threat. And that was certainly the feeling that was on the ground in Marrakesh not quite a year ago. The rising influence of non-state actors is apparent, and has been increasingly apparent. And Michele's work on this is groundbreaking, and it points to the ways in which we're developing rather an isolated collection of state actors in sort of old tragedy of the commons and collective action problem sort of way. My students too should recognize that. But rather a network of resilience with interdependence in very profound and important ways. And this network, which is increasingly part of global climate governance, is extraordinarily good at a bunch of things. It's great at setting motivation for ambition, for generating coordinated responses of a certain kind, a political kind, a communication strategy kind, to political actors. It's great for, to the extent anybody's good at this, communicating science and developing scientific consensus, right, much better than governments. It's great for providing economic and political support. Like I still have this deep-seated hope that the reinsurance and insurance industries on the international level will provide some buttressing to some of the less active engagement by certain political parties, right? NGOs inspire and then threaten politically and can move action, sometimes slowly and sometimes more quickly. Banks provide funding, insurance and reinsurance, again, to help manage risk. These are great benefits. But not everything can be done by non-state actors. And I think I'm going to just point to a couple of the gaps there at the international arena, especially, although we have a domestic example we shouldn't ignore at this point, as we're thinking about. States themselves, and by states here I mean countries, of course, and by non-states I'm including provinces and states and economic entities and think tanks and academic research institutes. Those are all non-state actors, to the extent they're actors at all. When I'm talking about states here, I'm talking about countries, nations, nation-states. They're really good at coordination, particularly rapid coordination, developing legal jurisdictions and operating within the legal jurisdictions. In fact, in many cases, they're the only ones who can do those things. They're good, to the extent anyone is, at large-scale, speedy responses. And they're in fact necessary in some cases for long-term planning that goes beyond the vicissitudes of political careers and beyond the variability of economic markets. And all these things need to be done. So it's worth thinking about that in the context of the US disengagement from the Paris process. While the general approach to the Paris process, and the way we think about it commonly, is focused on mitigation, that is the reduction of our emissions, and adaptation, that is adapting to our changing climate, to those things we can't mitigate away from, to the changes we're committed to. Those are usually the two standard pillars. I think that there's a third pillar that's increasingly part of the policy profile. Say that fast 3 times. Sorry, I'm a philosopher, so saying anything quickly is difficult. Staying on task is difficult, and not making smart aleck comments as I'm speaking is even harder. Especially when I do with climate change, everything's depressing. If I don't make constant jokes, I'll get sad. So there's this third pillar of climate change policy that's increasingly important and becoming increasingly prevalent in the scenarios, and that's loss and damage. So this has been part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change discussions since their inception in 1992. And in fact, there were worries and concerns about this long before that, before there was even an inkling of such a policy movement in the United Nations arena. This third pillar, loss and damage, it focuses on a wide range of issues. You can run through the documents. But the 3 that are worth thinking about in this context are first, slow onset events. Events like sea level rise and changing agricultural patterns. Things like extreme events, which include things like droughts and the outbreaks of wildfires and things like hurricanes. And then as a result of both of those, we have another issue, which is just displaced persons, climate refugees, which now have their own work program in the United Nations Framework Convention, but under the Paris Agreement. So after Paris, the Trump administration engaged in a policy of disengagement, explicitly so. And let's just be clear what's happening here. This isn't just the withdrawal from a treaty, and that the legal issues there are complicated, right? That a real formal withdrawal from a treaty will take between 3 and 4 years from the point of engagement. I mean, we can run through the legal permutations of this. But in the background, there's just the general removal of effort, the failure to send representatives to political meetings, the failure to engage scientists in these meetings, the failure to hire people who are qualified, and the failure to fund anything at all ever associated with climate change. And what this does is it basically eviscerates the resources necessary to respond to things. Okay, so let's be clear, to me at least, from my point of view, what disengagement from the process means. And I'm furthest from Peter, so I can't see him tell me my time is up. So
Squirming.
Okay, all right. So the disengagement process is taking place can be buttressed and can be responded to in terms of mitigation and adaptation by means of economic incentives and non-state actors. But where the problem, from my point of view, is where those particular functions of state actors that can't be easily replaced by these networks. And to wind it up quickly and to just put a little punchline on it, it seems to me that what's probably going to happen, and what we might even see the inklings of happening now, is the disengagement of large-scale state actors means that those groups of people who are furthest removed from the economic incentives and political actions of NGOs, the most vulnerable people in the world, will be the ones who are most affected by this disengagement. The ones the loss and damage protocols are most effective on, namely people who are most vulnerable to the rapidly changing climate, will be the ones that need the most help from slow onset events and extreme events. These are the people that need the most help from state actors, and when the state actor disengages, there's no help to be had. When we pull out of Paris, right, vulnerable people suffer. And so my worry is, right, now that we're moving forward in a different world where state actors opt in and out, we add an additional level of vulnerability to the most vulnerable people. And the legacy of Paris, to my mind, is just that, right? We've increased the vulnerability of those who need powerful state actors the most.
So I think we've heard 3 very interesting perspectives from the panelists on this. I'd like to follow up with what Ken raised. which is the issue of budgets and how national scale budgets are linked to national scale policy. And then what, I'm wondering if Bill and Michele might want to respond a little bit to the notion that federal funding in some cases might be fairly critical for enabling the kind of local, regional, and state action to which you properly point to as a reason to be optimistic. So how big of a deal is the funding, and does that challenge your more positive views a little bit?
So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at the federal budget and understand how, at least at the federal level, there's really an effort to unwind climate action. It may not have the impact at the state and local level just because of this momentum that's happening otherwise with state and local actors. When I say state actors, I mean actually states.
States, right.
But I don't want to minimize this. You know, we probably do more research than anywhere in the world on climate, and I would say research budgets are the things that I worry about the most. Diana Walls in the back for a long time has been affiliated with the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation has funded a great deal of work around the country. We have in Colorado some of the best research institutions on air quality and really on climate in the world. And you know, we have a group in Colorado, based in Colorado, called the University Center for Atmospheric Research, and it runs a variety of other, like the INCAR and those kinds of things. And I worry every day that those budgets are going to be impacted in a negative way by the Trump administration. And you know, that's where we're going to feel it. I mean, taking the EPA and taking climate change out of their sort of mission, you know, the budget, I think, is still going to have its defenders in the United States Senate, the United States Congress, and enough that the EPA budget isn't going to look like the president's budget. Same with the Department of Energy. They pretty much disassembled everything that was sort of about climate change inside the Department of Energy. There's a lot of people who are defending those national labs inside the Department of Energy. But I just think over time, there could be this erosion of an appetite inside Congress to continue funding that. And states and local governments don't have budgets for that. In fact, in the downturn, most states cut a lot of their funding on a variety of things that have to do with air quality. So you can have some impact at the federal level, even about things that may not be related to climate research. So I think there's a mixed bag. The other part of budgeting that I worry about, so at Paris, there was an agreement that the international community would fund vulnerable countries. It's called the Climate Fund?
Green Climate Fund.
The Green Climate Fund. I'm sorry. Well, I wasn't looking, I wasn't reading. But I think that's this other place where we've now made a positive statement, not positive, a negative statement, but we've said it, we're on the record of saying we're going to cut our funding to that. The United States cannot cut its funding and expect that the rest of the world is going to do what's necessary with the Green Climate Fund. Sorry to steal your point. Go ahead.
Michele?
Well, I was going to touch on all those points. I think it has limited implications on states and cities because they've figured out how to do what they're doing in the absence of federal support anyway. I think it's a missed opportunity for the federal government to make investments that would allow for scaling up and sort of ramping up of what's happening at the state and local level. I think the implications for research, as the governor said, I mean, the U.S. is sort of the epicenter of research on climate change. And so cutting that support not only has implications nationally, but globally. And then, of course, pulling out of the Green Climate Fund essentially is snubbing our noses at the most vulnerable people in the world. So in a practical sense and from a political sense, it's not ideal.
Let's change focus a little bit back up to the global level. And I think that Bill mentioned this in his introductory remarks, but one of the other implications of withdrawal from the Paris process is that the U.S., while it may for a while maintain a seat at the table, it's unlikely to be perhaps chairing the discussions and leading discussions. We always think in the U.S. that the U.S. is the leader of everything, and the U.S. really hasn't been necessarily always the leader on climate change. But in the creation of the Paris document, the Paris Agreement, the U.S. played a very important role in pushing that through. And one of the things that's often not appreciated about Paris is the need for continued action under it. They established a certain set of goals and targets, that countries are then using their own national means to pursue, but it's clear to everyone involved in the technical end of this that the targets are not, the near-term targets are not adequate to achieve the long-term goals. And so there's this need for an ongoing process. And so what is the U.S. Decision to remove itself from that process going to do to the future of the negotiations and to the resolve of nations to continue dealing with the problem?
One of the reasons the Paris Agreement worked at all was that there were a whole series of bilateral negotiations that took place bilaterally outside of the main chambers. And those took place because there were, calling them personal relationships is an overstatement, but there were people who knew each other from the long-term political processes that had taken place. And there were countries that had detailed dialogues outside of standard political channels at the highest level. And because they had those channels and those ways of going, for example, we made agreements with India that allowed India to sign on to the Paris Agreement, and otherwise they almost certainly would not have. The same thing happened with the announcements from China the summer before the Paris Agreement. That also came through a bilateral, a series of people working outside of main state channels. In some cases, those operate through non-governmental organizations that they serve as mediators or motivators and help develop certain panels. If we don't have people engaged in the climate process, it's not merely, which is the big deal of not having people at the table. We don't have the kind of relationships and political arrangements that allow for these things to take place and move forward, right? And that's accepting from the larger political context that I'm sure one of my fellow panelists will talk about. So I think that's a huge deal. I mean, we weren't party to the Kyoto Protocol, so we were at those meetings in a status of being party to some of the other agreements that were associated with that, with the climate change. We're part of the UNFCCC, so we were there. So we have always had a nod standing, but the disengagement is what worries me, that separation from the process.
Can I tell a story?
Okay, if you're gonna tell a story, you're gonna steal my points.
I will. That's not your point. You just think the same way. So I had the fortune, the privilege of being in Paris. It was last week, and just because of work that we've done here at CSU, and I know the Secretary of Energy at the time, Ernie Moniz, and the administrator for the EPA, Gina McCarthy, and then a lot of other people working for them. And they would say, like on Wednesday, so the agreement was signed on Saturday, they'd say, this is the day the president calls Prime Minister Modi of India. So India is the third largest emitter economy-wide. China's number one, we're number two, India's number three. India's moving up. China moved way ahead of us in the last 4 or 5 years. We were the number one emitter. We're still overall by volume the largest carbon emitter. So we're the three big emitters. And they'd say, today he calls Prime Minister Modi. And then on Friday, so Friday morning it was like, this is the day he calls President Xi, President of China. So Barack Obama was personally engaged in getting those countries to actually sign declarations that a year before that, most people who were really involved, intimately involved in this, would have been surprised by. And a year later, they were saying this very much has to do with the leadership of the United States and with the fact that the President of the United States had decided climate was going to be part of his second-term legacy. He didn't really talk a lot about climate, if you remember, in his first term, nor did he talk a lot about it in the campaign in 2012. And then he pivoted in a really serious way, and this is the demonstration. So we lack that. The other thing I will say, though, is it's not all bad news, because while China said we're going to take their place, China has other reasons to do this beyond climate change, and they continue to move because of the public health hazard of air quality throughout that country. They need to move, and there are a lot of things that they're doing that will help them get to a Paris target for 2025 and then 2030 that they actually do because of public health issues and air quality issues and morbidity and mortality around pulmonary disease that they don't talk about climate change. But the good news then at the time in Paris was that the United States really was holding it together.
Well, I guess so the point I wanted to make was, I think we need to watch closely what happens. So some of what Bill was just saying about the Chinese continuing to engage for a variety of other reasons. So we want to watch, for different countries, do they back up the rhetoric? Do they keep sort of fulfilling their promises? The other thing is, this hasn't gotten as much coverage, but there were some statements a few weeks ago from President Trump suggesting, well, maybe we won't withdraw from Paris if they're willing to sort of renegotiate to something that we like. So what I think is going to be really interesting is to watch how the international community responds to that, because absolutely in the early years of climate change politics, it was all about keeping the U.S. at the table and engaged, and they bent over backwards to produce agreements. There's a word in the framework agreement, it's aim instead of, we shall aim to reduce our emissions instead of we shall actually reduce our emissions to appease the U.S. That, I think, is going away, and it remains to be seen whether the rest of the international community says, okay, let's put everything else in the back burner and bring the U.S. to the table, or if they just say, you know what, we're good, and let's keep going. So I think that is something to watch.
All right, let's open it up to some questions from the audience. If you would raise your hands, I will try and call you in as best I can in order. And if you would say who you are and then pose your question, that would be great. Let's start right here in the front row.
Home Frost. I think Ken said we need some great nation states, influential. But when you listen both to Ken and to Bill, you not only need great nation states, you need some influential national leaders who believe in the cause at the head of those nation states. Right, is this a great man theory? Great woman theory of what's going on, or is it a great nation theory of what's going on? Or you gotta have them both.
Both. I mean, I really think, you need to have this resilient network, you need to have states that are on board, and you have to have people who are able to work between the two. This, to paraphrase someone, politics is hard, right? And this is the largest policy initiative ever undertaken by the human species, right? And it requires, we have a very complicated response. A resilient system, state actions, and actors who are engaged in that system. So all of the above.
I think Ken's point that there are certain things that nation states or countries, national governments, certain functions that they do better than anybody else, and we need them to fulfill those functions. So we need them engaged. They do those best when they are run by strong leaders, right? But the thing also, and again we'll go back to the U.S. example, that there are institutions in place that constrain in some ways what a leader can and cannot do. So again, another thing that's happening in the U.S. is, even though President Trump comes and says, I want nothing to do with the Clean Power Plan, it actually is, the Supreme Court has said you have to regulate CO2s because it's harmful to human health. So there's actually a requirement in place that, you can't just sort of abandon that, and, this is going to be played out in the courts. So, I think you also have to think about other institutions. It's not just dependent on the individual, it's the institutional context in which the individual is placed.
The other thing, and it's a little bit beside the point, but Michele alluded to this before, nation states can do all they want. The corporations of this world have a great deal of influence in this conversation. So at Paris, there was a group of people who were speaking, and one of them was the chair of Walmart, Rob Walton. Walmart last year had revenues of $482 billion. And so it's the leader of Fortune 100, right? But if there are 70-some companies, corporations in the Fortune 100 that have sustainability goals, and this year the shareholders, this is a different point, the shareholders of ExxonMobil said, ExxonMobil, you have to identify climate risk, because private equity companies, Blackstone and an asset manager Vanguard said, we're voting our shares for climate this time. We didn't the last time. The shareholder resolution lost, this time it won, and it won in one of the big 5 oil companies in the world. And so that actually can have as much or more influence than a 4-year administration with a president who doesn't believe in climate change. You can have a lot of impact at the corporate level, and so all of these kinds of things working together can be as important or more important even than a weak leader.
So great business leaders overpower a weak president.
I can.
Amen.
Yes, you.
Hi, Carrie Weiner with CSU Extension. I've noticed that the free market has largely moved in favor of clean energy, and it seems now there are a couple of attempts, or possible attempts by the Trump administration to kind of interject in terms of considering a tariff on solar from China, and maybe propping up coal and nuclear by saying, they have energy fuel on site, and we should value that, and therefore kind of prop up those 2 forms of generation. And that seems antithetical to the general kind of Republican philosophy of not getting involved in the free market. So I'm wondering, if anyone has any comments on, how that might end up playing out domestically, how Republicans outside the administration might respond, and kind of what you see from that.
Yeah, so the most recent thing is the Secretary of Energy sent a letter to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission basically saying, in order for there to be the necessary reliability on the energy grid in America, we want you to consider subsidizing coal and nuclear. So I had my son, when he was in 7th grade, once asked me what the definition of irony was. And irony is a hard thing to define for a 7th grader. I would say, hey, it is a former Texas governor telling a federal agency to subsidize coal. I mean, these guys have been beating up on the federal government. They've been beating up on subsidies. They've been doing a variety of things to just try and push back against this clean energy momentum. And they've done it, in a way that would make what you said they did last week an anathema, like you said. And so I think there's going to be a lot of pushback. One of the things that's a reality that they can't fight against is the market is what's forcing coal into its demise. Our center did a study of the Western grid, and we're pretty confident, and utilities do not disagree with us, that 90% of all the coal in the Western grid will be gone in 20 years. 20 years may seem like a long time if you're a sophomore in college. It's not a long time in the world of energy. Stuff moves like an iceberg in the world of energy and energy portfolios, and this is moving precipitously. 20 years and coal is gone. And what replaces it is a good and an open question, but they are trying to prop it up with subsidies because of sort of these campaign promises. They're going to resuscitate a dying industry, and they're operating against market forces.
Let's go back to the side of the room. Yes, you.
My name is Liz Kikabi. I think Governor Ritter said before that the emissions from the transportation sector are still rising in comparison to the energy sector, which has fallen or improving. And I think you implied that it's because it's something that the federal government has to deal with. Can you
No, I think
talk
we just
about
paid more attention to it. Actually, today, 6 Western governors signed an agreement to work on electric vehicle corridors. So imagine, the governors of Idaho and Utah, these guys were not like at Woodstock or anything. They did not live in Haight-Ashbury before they became governors. They're pretty conservative people, and they are going to be part of developing electric vehicle corridors. I don't know if you saw it yesterday, but Ford and GM announced they're going to have 13 separate models of electric vehicles. And so we think electrification of the grid is going to happen, and the EV industry is going to be part of the uptake. And utilities have seen this decline in their load because of a variety of things having to do with distributing the energy used on sunroofs, or people being more conservation minded about energy. electric vehicles are a way for utilities to actually have a business model that works going into the future. So we're seeing utilities be interested in that, and again, bipartisan groups of governors across the country understanding electric vehicles are a part of our future. We just haven't focused on transportation policy and emissions related to that as we were the energy sector over the last decade.
Well, and when I first started studying cities, this came up a lot, where cities said, we actually don't have much jurisdiction over transportation. It's something that crosses our borders, or we're dependent on federal highway dollars, or the state, which is dependent on federal highway dollars. And so it was much easier within their jurisdiction to do things in the energy sector. And this is an example where I think there's a missed opportunity, that there are things, if you had changes in the funding structure for transportation at the federal level that sent signals and allowed for some changes to be made at other levels of jurisdiction, I think there's a lot of things that we could do. So it's encouraging to hear that some governors are sort of taking the lead on that.
A lot of cities are doing EV infrastructure, and Department of Transportation grant funding for cities, for municipalities. They had requests from all over America. They finally rewarded the big grant to Indianapolis in Indiana. Yeah, so this is happening across the country, and I don't want to sound too Pollyannish. There's a tough road ahead for us on the transportation sector and trying to understand how to electrify it in a clean way, but there is momentum.
Let's come back to this side of the room. I see a student down here that wants to ask questions. That's good.
Hi, my name's Emily Taylor. I'm an undergrad in Michelle's department, and I work for Ritter. So I was wondering if you guys could speak more to the relationship between state governments and the federal government, and how the history of federalism has kind of changed, considering that environmental policy is largely done at the state level. And I was wondering if you can talk about how the future of federalism may impact the U.S. role in international climate policy.
Wow. I have my own experience. I'll just say real quickly, it actually is a place where there's been far more federal activity. The Clean Air Act was passed by the United States Congress, and it was passed actually to pick up the bottom. Like there were a lot of states and cities that were not doing as much on clean air or clean water, and so other states may have been more active, but it was like, who are the bottom feeders here? How do we get them? The last state to file what's required as a state implementation plan, the first state implementation plan, was Texas. And, and it was because Texas was kind of this outlier that the EPA was formed, and not just Texas, but states. So it's a great example of where federalism has done remarkable work, actually. We have a cap and trade program in this country with sulfuric acid. That's a federal program that states have to comply with. So when I was governor, we had a variety of different things where they're called state implementation plans, but they were required by the EPA. And it's actually it's a place where federalism has worked, and I would argue worked very well until recently.
Well, what I always remind students, I guess this is a little bit different than Bill's perspective. The history of major environmental legislation, environmental policy in this country is from states to the federal government. So you can sort of look at maps of the first states to adopt clean water standards or clean air standards. It's the Californias of the world, it's the Massachusetts and New Yorks of the world. And eventually, you get people who are sort of under this patchwork of regulations turning to the federal government and say, hey, can you please, we just have one common set of rules. So the history of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, is from the activity of, building on the activity of states. And so, to think that there would magically be this federal climate policy that then would sort of be forced down on top of states is misreading how environmental policy happens in this country.
Going forward, I think there's a really interesting question of what happens with substate actors in the international policy arena. I don't have a prediction, but I'm really curious to see, is California's action, there are various actions, right? Do they constitute the action of a real actor who has ended up giving the equivalent of a de facto vote? If they can't formally be given a vote, but do they have that status? Or really is what they're doing pressuring the engagement of other actors, right? And that's when we see this political landscape shifting, and it hasn't settled yet. It's not clear. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen, sort of an academic way. I'm a little terrified more practices.
So Jerry Brown is probably the climate leader in America right now. Even though he's a governor of California, it's the 5th largest economy in the world, so markets pay attention to an economy of that size. But when he went to China, something unusual happened. He met with and was photographed on the front page of the Chinese newspapers with the president of China. And that almost never, ever happens. Second thing I would say about that is that China has a cap and trade program, or I'm not China, California. It's economy-wide, but Ontario has joined that. Quebec is looking at joining it, Montreal is looking at joining it, and so is British Columbia. Those are 3 Canadian provinces. They're saying we want to be part of that because it seems to be a functioning cap and trade program. Mexico is studying it because Mexico is looking at this entire energy transition as well and thinking about cap and trade as a part of their energy transition. So they're deciding whether or not they want to be a part of it. That, even without a treaty, because they can't enter into a treaty, right? California can, but even without a treaty, that makes California an international actor.
We have time for one more question. Let's go back here.
Hi, my name is Quentin Hugel. I'm a first year here at Colorado State. And my question is, why, with so many smaller governments willing to do this work that the federal government doesn't want to do, why is it important for us to be part of a deal like Paris?
Oh, that's a very provocative question to end on. So, I mean, my bias, I'm a scholar of international relations. I think multilateral cooperation is an important thing. What I always tell people is, I think the importance of these annual meetings, every year, 197 countries come together in a meeting. They're in Bonn this year, I think, right? To talk about this issue of climate change. They've been doing this since 1991. Every year they come together. Very few times do we hear about it because, they only reach agreement maybe 3 times in the last 24 years. But it's a really important space. And it's become a space, and Ken has been attending these meetings more recently than I have, but I often describe it as a 3-ring circus. So the negotiators are over here, like literally talking about semicolons and lots of technical stuff and being translated into six languages, and that's important stuff, but talk about moving like icebergs, right? Like that is slow, tedious stuff. If you sort of walk through the hallways of the venue, you have public art and public demonstrations. You've got, these NGOs, people walking around in polar bear costumes. If you walk around the city, there's demonstrations. So there's a lot of stuff that's trying to keep it, attention on these issues. And then there's this world of these side events. And for my money, that's where the side events, that's where the action's happening. And that's where people like the governor come and talk about what states are, US states are doing. Mayors get together, NGOs come together, indigenous peoples come together. And it's this world's, almost like this world's fair of climate action. And what becomes really important is having that presence and the networks that are created. And so, I think at the end of the day, it's great that there are all these different sort of pockets of people acting together, but this is a global issue. We do, at the end of the day, need a global response. And I think it's through these multilateral processes that you engage with this broad variety of actors. So I'm less concerned, quite honestly, with whether the Trump administration sends a delegation to go sit in these boring meetings, right? I'm more concerned about whether there are people in this country who are actually doing things, going and networking and sharing that information with others.
So and my response is a little bit I endorse everything Michele said. I would also say, I think if you care about justice, that there is this justice question at play here. Because we're an actor that has contributed to this problem in a really serious way. And I think Ken alluded to it earlier. The people who are going to get hurt, I would say, first and worst, are the vulnerable populations of the world. And it's not just for us to have been a part of the problem and to not be part of solving this and allowing people to get really hurt and to people to have to flee their homeland. And there will be conflicts, there will be, it's not to be an alarmist to say there's going to be death and dying as a result of this. And we in the United States, there's a moral imperative at work, not just because we're the economic leader of the free world, but also because we contributed to the problem in such a serious way that if we, I think, absent ourselves from things like the Paris negotiations or the Paris Treaty, we're actually occasioning maybe the gravest injustice we will know in humankind.
Ken, do you want to have the final word?
How do I follow that?
It seemed like I was channeling.
Boring
you.
coordination problem answer, but let's go with that instruction.
Okay, will you guys please join me in thanking the panelists?